Hello, folks. Tonight we're kicking off a journey unlike any other. Not through life, but through history's most unforgettable exits. The deaths that make you go, wait, that actually happened. From ancient warriors choosing fire over surrender to inventors who got killed by their own gadgets. History's most epic deaths tend to be more poetic than tragic. So before you get comfy, take a sec to like the video and subscribe only if you actually like what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see people tuning in from all over the globe. Now, turn off the lights, fire up the fan for some white noise, and let's enjoy tonight's ride. Let's start with Mithridates VI, a king, warrior, language whiz, and a guy so paranoid he turned himself into a live science experiment, ruling Pontus in the 1st century BC. Mithridates lived in constant fear of assassination, which is fair enough if you're a king back then. Poison was basically the medieval espresso quick, easy, and a royal party favorite. So what did he do? He started doing absolutely everything possible to kill himself. Poison ivy, a pinch, arsenic, a dab, belladonna, just a little sprinkle, over time. He built up near total immunity. His personal pharmacists even brewed a legendary antidote called Mithridium, a cure-all. So good, medieval docs were still trying to replicate it over 1,000 years later. This guy didn't just eat food, he challenged it. Try me, but then Rome showed up. They didn't care about his science project. Rome wanted Pontus. After a series of bloody clashes, Mithridates found himself cornered, betrayed, surrounded, and staring down, capture. The proud king decided he wouldn't let his enemies parade him in chains through Rome's streets. He reached for his old trusty friend, poison, only to find nada. After years of careful inoculations, he was basically immune to death. Well, at least that polite, graceful kind of death, like a chef who can't get burned or a fish that forgot how to drown. Mithridates outwitted his own escape plan. When Roman soldiers broke down the city gates, he turned to one of his mercenaries and said, "All right, Plan B, manual mode," and just like that. The king, who was smarter than poison, took a classic stab to the gut. Sometimes death doesn't need finesse, just consistency. Mithridates went down in history as the man who couldn't be chemically killed but still got stabbed like everyone else. Honestly, it's almost poetic, a reminder that no matter how good your plans are, fate keeps a rusty knife handy just in case. Next up, our story kicks off with a Viking. And like every good Viking tale, it's got beheadings, showboating, and revenge with teeth. Meet Sigurd Estensson, aka Sigurd the Mighty, a Nordic earl ruling the Orkney Islands in the 9th century, fierce in battle, proud of his wins, and clearly not the subtle type. Sigurd had a bit of a rivalry with a Scottish noble named Milebagh, the buck-toothed yes. That's a real nickname, and it gets way more relevant. Tired of the back-and-forth bickering, Sigurd challenged Bagh to a duel, each bringing 40 men. But Sigurd cheated. Viking style. He brought 80. The math wasn't in Bagh's favor. The result, a total massacre. Sigurd beheaded Bagh in the chaos and, in a move only describable as over the top, strapped the severed head to his saddle as a trophy on the victorious ride home. Consistent. Mithridates went down in history as the man who couldn't be killed by poison, yet somehow still got stabbed like everyone else. Honestly, it's almost poetic, a reminder that no matter how well you plan, fate always keeps a rusty knife handy just in case. Our next story kicks off with a Viking. And, like every good Viking story, it's got head-chopping, showy moves, and revenge served with a side of teeth. Meet Sigurd Esteinsson, aka Sigurd the Mighty, a Nordic earl, ruling the Orkney Islands in the 9th century. Fierce in battle, proud of his wins, and clearly not the subtle type. Sigurd had a bit of beef with a Scottish noble named Mileba the Buck-Toothed Yes. That's a real nickname, and it's about to get very relevant. Fed up with the back-and-forth fighting, Sigurd challenged Brea, each bringing 40 men. But Sigurd cheated like a true Viking. He brought 80. The math didn't exactly favor Brea. Result, a total bloodbath. Sigurd chopped off Brea's head in the chaos, and, in a move only describable as over the top, stuck the severed head onto his saddle as a trophy on the victory ride home. And this is where things go downhill fast. As Sigurd galloped through the countryside, feeling like a war god, Brea's head bounced beside him, swaying on the horse, and, just as fate would have it, one of Brea's famously huge teeth scratched Sigurd's leg. Just a scratch. No big deal. Right, wrong. It's the 9th century. No antibiotics. No neosporin. Not even a Band-Aid. Sigurd's wound got infected. He got seriously sick. And just a few days later, he was dead. Yep. Killed by the tooth of the guy he'd just beheaded. Brea lost the battle, but definitely won the revenge game. This is the kind of story that sounds like a legend. A warrior punished for his arrogance, and a reminder that sometimes karma bites back with a tooth, taken down by the tiniest, cruelest detail, a bite from his own past. While Viking tales usually come packed with tragic deaths, burning ships, and angry gods' curses, very few are as absurd as this. Sigurd rode home thinking he'd won. Instead, he became the joke in one of history's weirdest obituaries. So, here's a lesson, even if you win. Check your saddle, and don't tie your enemy's head to it. You never know what those teeth are plotting. Now, let's talk about Pius of Papyrus. A guy so good at winning, he lost an entire war just to prove it. This wasn't your average noble. Pius was Alexander the Great's cousin, a military prodigy, and a royal pain in Rome's backside. Known for loud victories. Technically, you win. But if you lose so much, you might as well stay home doing laundry instead of fighting. After years of exhausting campaigns, commanding elephants, and acting like a hero, Pius rolled into Argos to clean up Greece's political mess. Too late. He was tired. But honor and stupid decisions demanded one more fight. So, at midnight, Pius led his troops into the city. But this wasn't a Hollywood entrance. The elephants got stuck in narrow streets. The soldiers got lost. By morning, Pius, the great general, was sword-fighting random enemies in an alley like a drunken armor. And that's when fate decided to get funny. Up on the roof, an old lady was watching the chaos unfold. We don't know her name, but one thing's certain: she had opinions and a roof tile in hand. She decided it was time to get involved. With the precision of someone who's thrown stuff before maybe chickens, grandkids, or invading kings, she dropped the tile. Direct hit, the brick smashed straight into Pius's head. He dropped like a sack of old potatoes. One of the enemy soldiers, either confused or seeing a chance, rushed over and finished him off. So the man who survived the Roman legions, Macedonian politics, and his own massive ego was taken down by a Greek granny and some roofing tiles. No dramatic finish, no glorious charge, just a fall caused by poor roof maintenance. No statues were built for this old lady. No official medals for her brilliant use of architectural debris in urban combat. But honestly, there should be. And pious, he became a cautionary tale no matter how big your army. Gravity always wins. Next up is Grigory Rasputin, the Russian mystic, healer, and beard enthusiast whose death became the gold standard for over-the-top assassinations. Rasputin wasn't just a political headache. He was a cosmic problem. He was that annoying party guest who wouldn't leave, babbling spiritual nonsense and somehow hypnotizing the host's wife and all her friends. In this case, the host was Tsar Alexander of Russia, and the party was a monarchy on the brink of collapse. Obviously, the Russian nobles wanted him gone. They started politely, but Rasputin wasn't having it, so they moved on to plan murder. Poison. They baked him a cake loaded with cyanide enough to wipe out a village. Rasputin ate it, smiled, and asked for seconds. At this point, someone probably started sweating and switched to plan B, shoot him in the chest. Rasputin went down. Success. They leaned in to check. Huge mistake. He sat up like a horror movie villain and started screaming. You can bet someone screamed and dropped a glass. So, plan C, shoot him a few more times. In this case, the host was Tsar Alexander of Russia, and the party was a monarchy on the brink of collapse. Naturally, the Russian nobility wanted him gone. Politely at first, but Rasputin wasn't having it. So they moved on to plan murder. Poisoning. They baked him a cake loaded with enough cyanide to take down a whole village. Rasputin ate it, smiled, and asked for seconds. By now, someone probably started sweating and switched to plan B, shoot him in the chest. Rasputin went down. Success. They leaned in to check. Huge mistake. He sat up like a horror movie villain and started yelling. You can bet someone screamed and dropped a glass right then. So, plan C, more bullets. He fell again, but wasn't done yet. Rasputin crawled across the floor, supposedly trying to escape the palace. Why not? The earlier bullets didn't stop him. At this point, the assassins were out of tricks, so they tied him up, dragged him to the riverbank, and threw him into the freezing water. You know, just to be sure. And here comes the final twist. When his body was found downstream, people said his hands were clawing at the ice, implying he was still alive underwater, trying to escape. And apparently, he succeeded. It took poison, bullets, blunt trauma, and drowning for Rasputin to finally kick the bucket. If they'd tried stabbing him with garlic or shoving a stake into his heart, no one would have even blinked. So, what's the takeaway here? Never underestimate a man with questionable hygiene, dubious theology, and skin that seems made of iron. Next stop, Chrypus of Sully, a Stoic philosopher from ancient Greece. Today, Stoics are known for their seriousness. They preach emotional control, rational thinking, and enduring hardship like champs. But Chrysippus, he literally laughed his head off one afternoon. While doing whatever ancient philosophers did between lectures, probably pacing dramatically in a toga, Chrysippus noticed something odd, a donkey eating a fig. Yep, that's the scene. But Chrysippus, clearly in the mood, told his servant, Give that donkey some wine to wash down the fig, and that's when it happened. He started laughing and just couldn't stop. Not a polite chuckle or a sly philosopher smirk, this was chest-shaking. Wheezing, tear-streaming laughter that ended with his death. That's right. The guy who could lecture for hours on the nature of the universe died because he thought the image of a donkey eating fruit and sipping wine was just too dang funny. To be clear, this wasn't the first weird way a Greek philosopher kicked the bucket. One supposedly choked on a fig. Another fell down a well while stargazing, but Chrysippus really committed to the bit. Picture this scholars gathered, ready for another deep moral lesson, only to find their teacher flat out on the floor. Still smiling, probably middle-aged, and definitely dead. Not exactly the legacy Plato hoped for. There's a beautifully ironic twist in Stoicism, a lifetime of emotional control undone by a joke. Like a fire safety instructor, juggling matches next to curtains, and that's a legacy to brag about. People might forget your metaphysical theories, but dying from laughing at your own donkey joke, that's going down in history. Some say laughter is the best medicine. In this case, not so much. Now, let's meet Franz Reichelt, a visionary, an ambitious guy who thought, why should birds have all the fun? Franz was an Austrian living in Paris in the early 1900s. But he didn't just sew suits, he wanted to stitch history. His big idea was a wearable parachute. Yes. France dreamed up a jacket that could turn into wings. Fashion meets aviation. Early flight was chaos. Planes looked like giant kites, and crashing was more common than landing. So France figured if a pilot had to bail, at least he could glide down in style. After countless tests and prototypes mostly ending with dummies hitting the ground, France was ready. Or so he thought, despite friends and officials begging him not to. He insisted on testing it himself. And what better stage for this grand debut than the Eiffel Tower? It was 1912. France showed up to media fanfare, proudly wearing his flying jacket. Reporters gathered, cameras rolled, even the cops were there, mostly hoping to stop him, but also a bit curious. He climbed the tower, waved to the crowd, and stood on the stone platform. Then he jumped. The chute didn't open. Not even a little. France plummeted straight down like a tailor-shaped brick, hitting the ground at a speed we don't measure in miles per hour, but in pure ouch. He died instantly, leaving behind a crater, a tangled jacket, and an awkward silence among the onlookers. It's a tragic ending, if it weren't so ironic. A man trying to make falling safe. By falling, he went out doing what he loved inventing, more than the Eiffel Tower. This was 1912. France was soaking up the media spotlight, proudly flaunting a flying jacket. Reporters gathered, cameras rolled. Even the police showed up, mostly hoping to stop him, but also a little curious. He climbed the tower, waved to the crowd, and stood on the ledge. Then he jumped. The parachute didn't open, not even a little. France plummeted straight down like a tailor's brick, hitting the ground at a speed we don't measure in miles per hour. But in pain, he died instantly, leaving a crater, a twisted jacket, and an awkward silence among the witnesses. That would be a tragic ending if it weren't so ironically ridiculous. A man trying to make falling safe by falling. He went out doing what he loved, which was invention. Unfortunately, his final prototype was also his last moment on Earth. And no matter how cruel history can be, it doesn't remember him as a tailor, not even as an inventor. but as a flying tailor. A guy who aimed for the sky and ended up crashing to the ground. If you thought being a Roman emperor meant eternal glory, with grapes served on silver platters, let me introduce you to Valerian, the only Roman emperor ever captured in battle and then turned into furniture. Valerian ruled in the 3rd century AD, when the Roman Empire was falling apart like an overcooked lasagna. Plague, civil war, barbarian invasions. Every year brought its own special chaos. Still, Valerian tried to hold it all together. One of their main headaches was the Persians, specifically a king named Shapur, who had zero patience for Roman attitude. So the Valerians gathered their troops and marched east, dead set on showing who's boss. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. At the Battle of Edessa, the Roman army got wiped out, and the Valerian king was captured, a rare sight back then. Catching an emperor was like trapping a unicorn in a bear trap. You'd think Shapur would ransom him or play some diplomatic chess to gain power. Nope. Shapur had a better idea. He turned the Valerian king into a human punching bag. Seriously, every time Shapur rode out, he had the ex-emperor dragged out to kneel under his boot in public. Not just humiliation, but humiliation choreographed like a dance. And just when you think it can't get worse, oh, it gets worse. After years of decline, the Valerian king died in captivity. How? Sources disagree. But the most gruesome version says Shapur skinned him, stuffed him with straw, and put him on display as a war trophy in a Persian temple. A warning to Rome, a win for Persia. And honestly, that has to be the worst day ever for a stuffed guy. Rome was not thrilled. They never officially acknowledged what happened to Valerian. They acted like he just vanished. Probably retired to sip wine somewhere. Right, sure. But Valerian's fate is etched deep in history. A mighty emperor brought down by arrogance, bad strategy, and a king with a twisted sense of humor. Meet King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. A king remembered not for ruling a country, but for losing a jewel in his own dinner. Adolf Frederick ruled in the 18th century. A relatively chill time for Sweden. He wasn't known for wars, sweeping reforms, or writing deep philosophical essays. Nope. He's famous for eating himself to death, and not metaphorically. This wasn't some tragic tale of ambition gone wrong. This was literally the death of a buffet. It was Fat Tuesday in 1771, the last day before Lent, perfect excuse to indulge. And King Adolf went all in. Historical records say he ate lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, champagne, smoked herring, and 14 servings of his favorite dessert, semla. If you've never tried semla, imagine a cardamom-spiced bun filled with almond paste and whipped cream floating in warm milk. Delicious, fluffy, but harmless. Unless you eat 14 of them in a row. Then they turn into a Viking curse disguised as a pastry. After this heroic feat, the king reportedly complained of stomach pain, which is the nicest way history can say he threw a full-on revolt in his guts. He died soon after. Cause of death: digestive problems. They said, in modern terms, a deadly case of food regret. The Swedish people were genuinely shocked. One minute you have a king, the next he's defeated by dessert. Not a murderer, no rebellion, just jelly, cream, and almonds. There's something strangely poetic about it. A king enjoying his last moments, indulging in the luxury that defined his life. The court tried, to keep it dignified? But history, well, history remembers the menu. To this day, Sweden celebrates Fat Tuesday with semla. And yes, every year someone remembers the king who loved them just a little too much. Now let's move on to Dionysius of Sinope, minimalist, social critic, and the most famous button pusher in ancient Greece. Dionysius was a skeptic philosopher, a polite way to say he didn't care what anyone thought. Wore the same robe every day. Ancient Greece's most famous button pushers. Dionysius was a skeptic philosopher, fancy talk for, I don't give a damn what you think. Every day he wore a long robe and lived in a giant clay pot. He believed in a life free of possessions, social expectations, and personal shame. And he practiced what he preached loudly, publicly, and sometimes without even realizing it. So, how did this grumpy legend meet his end? Well, ancient sources don't agree, which is always a red flag in history storytelling. But one of the most entertaining tales says Dionysius died from holding his breath. Yep, voluntarily. Like, I'm done with this world. Please, no more air. Some say it was an act of will, a final. Others suspect he was just being stubborn, maybe trying to prove a point about controlling his own destiny. Fair enough. There are plenty of other theories about his death. One version says he choked on an octopus. Another claims he got bitten by a dog, which sounds a bit poetic considering his fondness for dog metaphors. But the breath-holding theory stuck. Probably because it sounds so Dionysius. This was a guy who once walked the streets at noon holding a lantern, claiming he was looking for an honest man. A guy who told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man on earth, to move aside because he was blocking the sun. So, yeah, choosing to stop breathing just because you're over everyone else fits right in. And the best part? Everyone respected it. The same society he mocked, challenged, and rejected ended up honoring him with a public tomb. Turns out, being great at dropping killer one-liners is a pretty solid way to get remembered. Dionysius died exactly as he lived, dramatic, weird, and totally on his own terms. Now, let's talk about Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man so loaded he made other Roman millionaires look like weekend pottery sellers. Crassus wasn't just rich, he was insanely rich. He owned silver mines, real estate, slaves, and even a fire brigade. Yep, he had a team of firefighters who'd rush to burning buildings if you sold him the property first. The original Roman real estate shark, but he wanted more than gold. He wanted glory. He already had the cash. Now, he wanted to be remembered like Caesar or Pompey, dudes who conquered something way bigger than tax loopholes. So, in 53 BC, Crassus decided to invade Parthia, Rome's rich neighbor to the east. Think of it as Rome's version of Hold My Wine. I get it. It was a disaster. He seriously underestimated the Parthians, who had deadly archers, elite cavalry, and zero interest in being conquered. Crassus marched his army deep into the desert and straight into a trap. Thousands of Roman soldiers were slaughtered. His son got killed. Morale crashed faster than Rome's aqueducts during budget cuts, and eventually Crassus got captured. Now the Parthians knew who he was. They'd heard the legends about Rome's richest man, a guy obsessed with wealth to the point of being a walking coin purse. So, as a parting gift, they executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. Yep, you read that right. The richest man in Rome died choking on money. This wasn't just an execution. It was a brutal theatrical performance. A dramatic message. You want gold here. Shove it right into your lungs. Some call it a tall tale. Others say it's exaggerated. But even if the story isn't exactly true, it spread like wildfire across Rome. And that's history for you. Sometimes it prefers poetic justice over boring facts. Crassus's spectacular death became a cautionary tale not just about greed, but about arrogance, about flying too close to the sun while clutching a bag of coins. If you've ever heard the phrase, "I am Spartacus," you know behind the meme and movie moment was a man who fought until no one could stand, including himself. Spartacus wasn't born a hero. He was a Thracian soldier, captured by the Romans and thrown into the brutal, no mercy gladiator world. Not Hogwarts for gladiators, but more like daily beatings, with the occasional stale bread. He trained, survived, and then rebelled in 73 BC, along with about 70 other gladiators. Spartacus escaped using kitchen knives and anything not nailed down. Act of arrogance, flying too close to the sun while clutching a bag of coins. If you've ever heard the phrase, "I am Spartacus," you know that behind the meme. And movie moment is a man who fought until no one else could stand, including himself. Spartacus wasn't born a hero. He was a Thracian soldier, captured by the Romans and thrown into the brutal, no mercy gladiator world, which was less Hogwarts and more daily beatings with the occasional stale bread. He trained, survived, and then rebelled. In 73 BC, along with about 70 other gladiators, Spartacus escaped using kitchen knives and anything not nailed down. Within weeks, they crushed Roman patrols and gathered thousands of runaway slaves and outcasts. It became a full-blown slave revolt right in the heart of Rome's pride. For 2 years, Spartacus led this rebel army. They defeated trained legions, embarrassed Roman generals, and threw the Senate into panic. And through it all, Spartacus refused to be a footnote. He wasn't just running away. He was fighting back. But Romans hate being humiliated for long. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus. Yes, Cassus. The man with a throat of molten gold from the last chapter. Got the job to stomp out the rebellion before it turned into a full-on revolution. Eventually, Spartacus and his army got cornered in southern Italy. Outnumbered, surrounded, running low on supplies, 0 escape routes. But Spartacus didn't throw in the towel. Nope. He did what Spartacus always did. He fought, according to ancient sources. He charged straight at Cassus, slicing through soldiers like a guy who absolutely refused to quietly back down. He got wounded, reportedly stabbed multiple times, but kept on fighting until he vanished in the chaos. His body was never found. No victory parade. No captured king dragged up the Roman steps, just poof, gone. But his legend lived on. Rome nailed over 6,000 of his followers to the Appian Way as a warning. Still, they couldn't erase the inconvenient truth one guy, starting with kitchen knives, almost shattered their empire's pride. Spartacus didn't just die. He refused to quit. And that ending echoes louder than any emperor's throne. In the chaotic twilight of the Roman Republic, when senators debated wine and civil war during lunch breaks, one name flickered briefly before vanishing spectacularly: Lucius Junius Brutus Demisippus. Back then, Demisippus wasn't famous, but he was a Roman general and a loyal fanboy of Marius, one of the main players in the infamous Marius versus Sulla showdown. Think Rome's version of political Twitter wars, except everyone carried swords and legions when Sulla came back from the east with his battle-hardened troops. Rome got ready to rumble. Damisippus, loyal to the Marians, was on the losing side, caught in Sulla's brutal purge of enemies, a political spring cleaning. But with way more blood and fewer janitors, he got sentenced to death, along with some other high-profile prisoners. But here's where Damisippus earned his spot in history, as he and the others were led to execution. One condemned dude started crying, begging for his life, panicked. Damisippus just laughed and said, "Why the tears? Fool, don't you know why we're here?" And that was it. No sobbing, no last meal requests, just a sarcastic jab and a confident walk to the sword. That's the kind of reaction that screams, "I've read the script. No rewrites needed." In an era when last words could be poetic, desperate, or full of regret, Damisippus chose dry sarcasm. He faced death like it was a boring committee meeting, a bit inconvenient, but not worth losing your dignity over. Was he a great general? Probably not. Did he change history? Nope. But he left with more chill than most emperors, kings, or philosophers. And sometimes, that's enough. He faced death not with fear, but with a shrug, a joke, and perfect timing. If history could be assassinated by yearbook quotes at lunch, Caligula would be front cover with a full laurel wreath, smiling. Born Julius Caesar Germanicus, he started off promising. The Romans loved him. The army loved him. He was the son of a war hero raised in the royal palace. And for a brief shining moment in 37 AD, he looked like Rome's golden boy. Then, the cheese slid right off the cracker. Caligula's reign spiraled into a nightmare of paranoia, delusions, and performance art dictatorship. He declared himself a god, demanded worship, and famously appointed his horse as a senator. To be fair, the horse never showed up for sessions but had a marble stall, a gem-studded collar, and reportedly better manners than most senators. Caligula executed senators on suspicion and declared war on Poseidon. Yes, the sea god once ordered his troops to collect seashells for battle, spoils of war. This wasn't just madness. It was madness with a flair for the dramatic. Even his closest guards got tired of dodging his daily whims. His behavior was totally unpredictable. His punishments were straight out of a soap opera, and Rome was just exhausted from being ruled by a guy who treated reality like an optional suggestion. So, in 41 AD, a conspiracy led by members of his own Praetorian Guard, his personal security detail, decided it was time to act. They cornered him in a hallway beneath the palace. No speeches, no poetic goodbyes, just stabbing. Lots of stabbing. One source says over 30 wounds. This wasn't an assassination. It was a group project with extreme enthusiasm. His body was dumped in a shallow grave. No honor, no state funeral. Just the end of a man who once tried to replace statues of gods with statues of himself. Yet Caligula is remembered not for wisdom or reforms, but for turning Rome into a circus and ruling it like a nightmare. He died as disastrously as he lived, surrounded by blades. Betrayed by his own people, probably thinking, "My horse could run this place better." And honestly, he might have been onto something. Few deaths in history are as weird and wine-soaked as George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. If that name rings a bell, it's because George was smack in the middle of England's nastiest family feud, the Wars of the Roses. Think 15th century Game of Thrones, but with more velvet hats and zero dragons. George was the brother of King Edward IV and Richard III. Yep, that Richard III. and for a while. George was next in line for the throne. Unfortunately, George had two fatal flaws: ambition and zero self-preservation skills. He switched sides in the Civil War more times than you change socks, plotted rebellions, allied with whoever looked strongest that week, and made enemies faster than a medieval tax collector. Eventually, King Edward, fed up with George's constant backstabbing, sometimes very literal backstabbing, ordered his arrest for treason. Now Edward faced a problem. How do you execute your own brother without turning it into a PR nightmare? Enter the weirdest royal execution in English history. According to the chronicles, George was allowed to pick how he wanted to die, and legend says he chose drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Think about that. No hangman's noose, no axe, not even a dignified poison. Just a barrel of booze, like he wanted his obituary to read. Died doing what he loved. Was it a poetic, ironic joke gone too far? Historians still argue if it really happened, or was a later sarcastic addition. But the image sticks, and honestly, even if it's exaggerated, it sounds like something Clarence would have requested: messy, extravagant, and just a bit ridiculous. He was buried at Westminster Abbey, probably sober by then, mostly forgotten except for the flashy nature of his death. So if your family drama feels intense, just remember, at least no one's been convicted of treason, executed by wine barrel, and turned into England's most obvious cautionary tale. Classic ending, right? To wrap up our legendary quest for success stories, here's one proving that brilliance isn't a shield against a bad time. The death of Archimedes, ancient Greece's greatest thinker, ended, tragically killed by some guy who couldn't care less about geometry. Archimedes was a mathematician, engineer, and inventor. Basically, the guy who could look at a puddle and figure out fluid mechanics. He invented levers, pulleys, war machines, and was even rumored to have defended Syracuse with giant mirrors that set Roman ships on fire. Whether that's true or not, the guy was undeniably sharp. Too bad he wasn't exactly a people person. In 212 BC, Rome finally took Syracuse after a long, brutal siege. By then, he was fully sober and mostly forgotten, except for the rather dramatic nature of his death. So, if your family drama feels rough, just remember at least no one's been accused of treason, sentenced to death by barrel, and turned into the most straightforward cautionary tale in England. That, my friends, is a classic ending. To wrap up our legendary success hunt, here's a story proving that brilliance isn't a shield against bad timing. The death of Archimedes, ancient Greece's greatest thinker, was tragic, killed by some guy who didn't give a damn about geometry. Archimedes was a mathematician, engineer, and inventor. Basically, the kind of guy who could look at a puddle and figure out fluid mechanics. He invented the lever, pulleys, war machines, and supposedly even defended Syracuse with giant mirrors reflecting sunlight to burn Roman ships. Whether that's true or not, the guy was seriously sharp. Too bad he wasn't exactly a people person. In 212 BC, Rome finally took Syracuse after a long, brutal siege. Soldiers poured in, looting, shouting, hunting enemies. On the ground, there was an old man hunched over sketching diagrams in the sand. Archimedes himself. He was drawing, lost in thought, maybe trying to figure out the eternal truth of spirals, catapults, or how many camels it takes to fill a bathtub. A Roman soldier approached. Normally, you'd expect someone to see a guy with a sword, stand up, say hello, and plead, "Please don't kill me." But Archimedes, nah. He just looked up and said, "Hands off my circles." No explanations, no permission, just a hard geometric boundary. End of story. The soldier, probably offended, confused, or just plain hates math, killed him on the spot. A perfectly bureaucratic ending for one of history's greatest minds. When Roman General Marcellus found out, he was furious. He ordered strict orders to spare Archimedes. The man was way too valuable and too smart to waste. But alas, brilliance lost to a confused soldier and bad attitude. There's a strange kind of poetry in that. Archimedes, who calculated volumes of weird shapes and invented the screw pump, didn't fail because of a genius rival, but because some guy who probably didn't even know what a hypotenuse was. And just like that, one of history's brightest lights got snuffed out halfway through. Take it as a lesson if you're cooking up a big idea. Glance up now and then, especially during an invasion. Being royalty has perks. Velvet cloaks, endless parties, one or two private choirs, but as King Henry I of France learned in the 11th century, it doesn't come with much backup. By then, Henry wasn't so wild anymore. No more charging into battle shirtless or throwing throne room ragers. He was a relatively stable ruler, which made him a real medieval European king. He ruled from 1031 to 1060, dealt with some rebellions, raised a family, and built churches here and there. Nothing flashy, but people remember him not for his reign, but for how he left the stage. The story goes that one day, after sitting for a while, maybe praying, or just surviving a painfully long royal meeting, King Henry stood up too fast, and that was it. Down he went. Maybe a stroke, maybe an aneurysm, or just gravity reminding him who's boss. Whatever it was. He died shortly after. To be fair, 11th century medicine wasn't exactly known for accurate diagnoses. Probably some local doc waved herbs over his chest, muttered something about bad vibes, and suggested immediate bloodletting. Sorry, that didn't do the trick. And so, the King of France became one of the first recorded victims of what modern science calls orthostatic hypertension. That weird dizzy feeling when you stand up too fast and suddenly see stars. Except for him. It wasn't just dizziness. It was the final curtain call. Now, you might think dying from standing up too quickly is a bit of a letdown for a king. But consider the symbolism. A man who ruled for decades, survived wars, plots, and plagues, taken down by a sudden change in posture, like history whispering. Even kings aren't safe from leg cramps. In medieval Japan, where honor was often measured in sword strikes and dramatic exits, Shichuto Toyo opted for a quieter legacy made of ink, silence, and insane patience. Born in 1420, Shichu grew up in a temple, trained as a Zen monk, and like most monks, was expected to live a humble, meditative life with zero screw-ups. Except Shichu had a problem. He loved to draw like a maniac, obsessively, especially when he was told not to. There's even a famous story, that as a kid, punished and tied up for neglecting duties, he used his toes to draw a mouse on the floor, so lifelike that the monks freaked out. Yep. His doodles, while grounded, were terrifyingly realistic. Later, Shichu went to China to study ink painting. He returned to Japan with a bold, flowing, emotionally charged style that forever changed Japanese art. Landscapes seemed to breathe on the page. Yep. His doodles, while grounded, were all just ominous vibes. Then, Tsu went off to China to learn ink painting. He came back to Japan with a bold, flowing, emotional style that basically rewrote Japanese art forever. Landscapes practically breathed on the page. Mountains floated in mist. Trees had more personality than most dinner guests. The old guy got older, painting nature and emptiness, classic Zen themes. Unlike samurai, who died gruesome battlefield deaths or ritual suicide, Tsuso just kept painting. And when his time came, he faced death like life with a brush in hand. Legend says in 1506 on his deathbed, Tsuso asked for ink and paper. His final act, one bold brushstroke. The last line on the page, simple, powerful, mysterious, no signature, no explanations, just a stroke marking the exit, like saying, enough. No sword fights, no cherry blossom poisonings here. In 1506, Tsuso asked for ink and paper. His final act, a bold stroke. The last line on the page, simple, powerful, mysterious, no signature, no explanation, just a brushstroke marking the exit, like saying, that's enough. He didn't die in a sword fight or poison himself under a cherry tree. He just painted until he couldn't breathe anymore, letting the ink speak what words couldn't, a quiet death. But epic if you get the drama of leaving a silent masterpiece. So next time life gets noisy, think of Tsuso. Sometimes the last word is just a line. If you've ever imagined a samurai's death as noble, cinematic, and cherry blossom covered, Saigo Takamori is the guy your imagination is borrowing from. Born 1828, Saigo rose as a warrior, rock star politician, and finally a reluctant revolutionary. He helped lead the Meiji Restoration, modernized Japan, scrapped feudalism, and, unfortunately, turned samurai into about as useful as fax machines in the smartphone age. Many samurai adapted. Saigo, not so much. As reform spread, swords were banned, samurai pensions cut, and all tradition tossed aside. Saigo became the silent poster boy for disgruntlement. Then, in 1877, when the Satsuma Rebellion kicked off, he was front and center. What should have been a protest morphed into a war. Saigo and a few thousand loyal fighters marched against the imperial army, loaded with rifles, artillery, and way less nostalgic. For months, they fought outnumbered, outgunned, and definitely doomed. But Saigo refused to back down. Finally came the Battle of Shiroyama, the last stand, surrounded, wounded, watching his troops fall apart. Saigo turned to the remaining soldiers. What happened next is still debated. Did he perform seppuku, the samurai suicide ritual? Or was he too hurt and asked a loyal follower to end it quickly? Either way, he died with his sword nearby, facing a future he helped build but no longer belonged to. Japan mourned, then instantly made him a legend. The government that crushed him later pardoned him, put up statues, and started teaching kids in school how noble he was, like they never fired a cannon at him in the first place. Saigo became the perfect tragic symbol, the man fighting for honor, in a world that had already changed. Sometimes you don't have to win to be immortal. Just lose like a legend. Jesse James wasn't just an outlaw. He was America's rebellious icon, the guy holding a six-shooter in one hand and a train schedule in the other. Born in 1847 in Missouri, Jesse James started as a Confederate guerrilla, robbing Union soldiers and torching stuff at will. After the war, he thought, why stop now? And leveled up from rebel to full-time legend. leading the James Younger gang for decades, robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains all over the Midwest. To the press, he was a hero. To banks, a nightmare. To most cops, a moving target with a bounty so big it could cause trust issues in any friend group. This brings us to Robert Ford, Jesse's so-called friend and gang member. Recently promised a pardon and a $10,000 reward for helping put Jesse behind bars, living or dead. In April 1882, Jesse James was laying low in St. Joseph, Missouri, under an alias. Robert Ford and his brother lived with him like roommates, but with more guns and fewer boundaries. On the morning of April 3rd, Jesse unholstered his gun, a rare move, and climbed a chair to dust a framed picture on the wall. A quiet, almost domestic moment. Ford pulled out his pistol, aimed at Jesse's back, and shot him in the head mid-sentence, mid-move, mid-dust. The Wild West legend fell off his chair as his chores remained unfinished, both epic and utterly mundane. Robert Ford wanted to be hailed a hero. Instead, he got a lot of hate. The public didn't love Jesse because he was good. They loved him because he was bold. Killing him like that, not exactly heroic, conveniently so. Jesse James didn't die in a dramatic shootout or duel, but in his socks, betrayed by a guy drinking coffee. Sometimes, history isn't about a high noon showdown. Sometimes, it's just someone turning their back, and that's not bravery. Conveniently so, Jesse James didn't die in a dramatic shootout, but because of his own socks, betrayed by a guy sipping coffee. Sometimes, history isn't a noon duel. Sometimes, it's just someone turning their back, and someone else can't resist the payday. If you haven't heard of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, here's your quick intro. He wore a tall top hat and basically built half of Victorian England. Also, his name sounds like it should come with its own steam engine. Born in 1806, Brunel was the kind of genius who could sketch bridges over breakfast and casually redefine what impossible looked like. He built underwater tunnels, suspension bridges over valleys, and more, trains that went faster than your average snail pace. But his biggest dream? Ships. Big ones. Really big ones. In the mid-19th century, Brunel designed the SS Great Eastern, a steamship so gigantic it made other ships look like bath toys. Over 700 feet long, powered by both paddle wheels and propellers, and designed to sail from England to Australia without refueling. Unfortunately, it was cursed from day one. During construction, a bunch of workers died. There were fires, 2 failed launch attempts. One poor guy got stuck inside a hole for days before being rescued. The ship was so heavy it had to be launched sideways, which sounds cool until you realize it nearly flattened a warehouse. Brunel, already stressed out, chain-smoked cigars like they were oxygen and ended up having a stroke during all this. And not just anywhere, but right on the ship, while watching the engine room's fancy new feature demo. Some say stress killed him. Others blame the massive pressure of expectations. Either way, he died just a few days before the ship's maiden voyage in 1859. And here's the kicker on that very first trip. The ship exploded. A steam pipe burst. 6 people died. The ship survived the trip. But the dream didn't. Brunel's death wasn't dramatic like a battlefield or betrayal, but poetic. He was undone by his own brilliance, pushing beyond what humans could build and forgetting that physics and fate don't always go hand in hand. So while most folks get buried quietly, Brunel actually outlived himself, thanks to a near-collapsing skyscraper hanging over his legacy. Still, the bridges stand, the tunnels hold strong, and the hat remains iconic. Sometimes the most tragic deaths come from dreaming way too big, while reality just... Cleopatra, Selene II, was born into a world bursting with ambition, legends, and political warfare. Her mother was Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, who claimed to be the living goddess Isis. Her father was Mark Antony, the famous Roman general torn between loyalty to the Republic and love for the Egyptian queen. From birth in 40 BC, Selene wasn't just a kid. She was a symbol, a living promise that Egypt and Rome could rule together, not as enemies, but as partners. She was born in Alexandria, the city of wonders. Imagine growing up under marble columns and towering spires, where priests chanted in ancient tongues and philosophers argued under star maps. The Library of Alexandria was still alive, and the Isis cult was going strong. Selene and her twin brother Alexander Helios got a royal education in Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, and Roman politics. She learned to walk a path few could even see. But despite the rituals and incense, she was born into a political trap. Cleopatra and Antony split the Eastern Mediterranean like a wedding cake, handing out grand titles to their kids with no real armies to back them up. Little Selene was crowned queen of Cyrene and Libya before she could even talk. Her name meant moon, and she was the twin to her brother's son. But the moon would soon learn to survive in the shadows. Back in Rome, Octavian, later Augustus, watched all this with cold calculation. Antony and Cleopatra's alliance wasn't just scandalous, it was treason. When war broke out between Octavian and Antony, Selene's fate was sealed by grown-up choices she couldn't control. At just 10 years old, she saw her world collapse. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC ended with her parents' catastrophic defeat. Her dad killed himself. Her mom followed, famously by biting down on an asp instead of parading through Rome in chains. And then everything changed. Selene, once wrapped in gold, became a prisoner, orphaned, locked up by the very man who destroyed her family. But she didn't scream. She didn't break. History doesn't tell us her words, but it shows us her next move. She did something almost no royal kid does after a disaster she survived. And that was just the opening act. Once the dust settled in Alexandria, Cleopatra, Selene, just 10 years old then, got shipped across the Mediterranean as a trophy. She didn't arrive in Rome as a princess, but as a living symbol of Octavian's victory. She and her siblings were paraded through the streets in a grim spectacle. Cleopatra and Mark Antony's kids, now orphans, shackled in golden chains, marched under the shadow of the guy who crushed their dynasty. Pause and imagine that for a sec. The daughter of gods paraded like captured loot. The streets that once cheered Julius Caesar were now the stage for her humiliation. But Selene didn't cry. No records mention tears or tantrums. Instead, the Roman crowd, expecting a sobbing kid, saw a strangely composed girl. Some even said the crowd was kind of mesmerized by her. And in Rome, pity can be stronger than fear. Octavian, later Augustus, wasn't dumb. Killing Antony and Cleopatra's kids would wreck his carefully crafted image of mercy and civility, so he handed them over to his sister, Octavia, who just happened to be Antony's ex-wife. A cruel twist? Sure, but also a lucky break. Under Octavia's roof, Selene got educated, protected, and shockingly, a second chance. The woman Antony betrayed his marriage for became Selene's guardian. Octavia wasn't just a political player. She was known for grace and restraint, making sure Selene grew up with Roman discipline, Greek smarts, and just enough Egyptian dignity to remind everyone she was their daughter, right in the heart of Rome. The young queen watched closely. She studied survival politics. She learned when to speak, and when silence was the deadliest weapon. She mastered Latin, rhetoric, and read the myths of the very people who destroyed her family line. She saw how Roman women wielded power not with crowns, but with marriages, influence, and cunning, while her brothers faded into obscurity. Selene adapted. She didn't fight Rome with swords. She fought it by understanding it. She learned that survival meant becoming indispensable to the system that once tried to erase her. In public, she was a pawn, a Roman-style princess. But behind those calculating eyes was a girl quietly plotting her comeback on the world stage, not with rebellion, but with something way more dangerous: marriage. Cleopatra. Selene's switch from prisoner to queen wasn't muscle. It was strategy. As she hit her teens, Rome was reshaping the world in its own image, crowning puppet kings like chess pieces across its vast empire. Augustus, always the political puppeteer, saw Selene as both a threat and an opportunity, so he made a calculated move. He married her off. Her husband was King Juba II of Mauritania, a scholarly king raised in Rome. He was the son of a North African ruler who backed Julius Caesar, but lost everything when Caesar died. Like Selene, Juba was captured and raised in Octavia's house. He was smart, polished, and a true Roman at heart, basically. Augustus's safe bet a loyal king to Rome, but foreign enough to rule the empire's distant provinces. This marriage was more than a union. It was a diplomatic masterpiece. Two royal kids from conquered empires, both brought to Rome as trophies, now paired up to rule a kingdom they never asked for. But hey, it worked. Selene became queen of Mauritania, today's Algeria and Morocco, a land rich in culture but politically unstable. And she ruled not like a puppet, but like a visionary monarch. Selene and Juba together revamped their capital, renaming it Caesarea to honor Augustus. But it wasn't just a name change. Under Selene's influence, his capital and renamed it Caesarea in honor of Augustus. But it wasn't just a name change. Under Selene's influence, the city blossomed into a lively mashup of Egyptian luxury, Greek art, and Roman engineering. Temples were built, libraries established, coins minted with her image wearing the royal Egyptian sun crown. Subtle no. A strong nod to her ancestors. Selene wasn't just a queen. She stamped her mark on an entire region. While Juba focused on diplomacy and writing, he fancied himself a historian and geographer. Selene brought the ruling skills. She managed trade, sponsored the arts, and gave the kingdom a hybrid identity you couldn't confuse with anyone else's. Here, far from the shadow of Rome and the ruins of Alexandria, Cleopatra Selene didn't just survive. She thrived. Her life, once shattered by politics and bloodshed, became a rare thing in the ancient world, a story of peaceful reclamation. She wasn't just a symbol anymore. She was a queen, and she wasn't about to stop. Cleopatra. Selene wasn't content being just a ceremonial figure or Juba's quiet sidekick, born into an empire, shaped by tragedy and tempered by humiliation. She now sat on the throne with the whole kingdom at stake and brought Rome something it had never seen before. A queen who fused three civilizations into one vision. Mauritania was always a cultural crossroads. Berber tribes, Phoenician merchants, and the ghost of Carthage haunted its coasts. But under Selene, this mosaic had a plan. She didn't impose Egyptian dominance, nor did she fully bow to Roman tastes. Instead, she blended them together with finesse and purpose. She oversaw massive public works, ports, temples, and markets. Roman aqueducts snaked through cities rich with Egyptian symbolism. Statues of Isis stood near Roman forums. Greek theaters flourished alongside African-style crafts. The result wasn't a mess, it was harmony. A kingdom both ancient and modern, loyal to Rome, but with its own unique flavor. And through it all, Selene was front and center. That's pretty rare for a queen in a client kingdom. She appeared on coins not behind her husband, but beside him, decked out in royal garb that screamed British Queen vibes. The sun disk, the vulture crown, symbols of divine rule, quiet declarations. Egypt might have fallen, but their bloodline still ran through her veins. More than anything, Selene knew diplomacy was an art. She played Rome's game, but never let it own her. She hosted envoys, managed grain exports, and reportedly meddled in the kingdom's tax policies, especially in how wealth flowed through Mediterranean trade under her rule. Mauritania became a valuable Roman ally, not because they bowed down, but because they worked smart and made profits. Meanwhile, Rome's elite whispered about her weird bloodline and infamous mother's legacy. But Selene gave them no skeletons to exploit, no affairs, no rebellions, just progress, balance, and quiet dominance. Yet even with success, memories of Alexandria lingered. The fall of her dynasty, the cobra in the basket, her father's sword, it never left her side. But instead of trying to resurrect that lost legacy, she encoded it into her rule. Her kingdom became a sanctuary of synthesis. She didn't rebuild Egypt. She reimagined it thousands of miles away on Berber land. And in doing so, she built Mauritania into a dynasty of her own. Cleopatra, Selene, always lived in between. She was Egyptian by blood, raised in Roman lineage, and now a North African queen. But instead of picking one identity, she mastered all three. Daughter of Isis, but also a Roman woman, a Hellenistic intellectual, and ruler of desert tribes. In every role, she was all of them, and then some. But this dual nature wasn't just a slick political trick. It was survival. Selene knew what happened to women who got too ambitious. Her mother did and died a villain in Rome's eyes. She knew Rome admired caution in their queens, not boldness. So she walked a tightrope, always dignified, always calm. She didn't want scandal. She sought influence. One of her sharpest tools was symbolism. On Mauritanian coins, her image wasn't just decoration. She revived the pharaoh's sun crown and mixed it with Roman-style laurel wreaths, togas, and Latin inscriptions. These coins circulated across Africa and the Mediterranean, quietly reminding merchants, nobles, and Roman officials Cleopatra's blood still rules, and her influence stretches far beyond aesthetics. Selena encouraged religious blending. The Isis cult was allowed to thrive in Mauritania. But so were Roman gods like Jupiter and the native African spirits of the region. This wasn't religious tolerance. It was political glue. She knew what Augustus pulled off in Rome, uniting diverse folks under one temple. Now, she was doing the same, just with a bit more finesse in her own kingdom. But despite all her grace and calm, Selene was never just the sidekick to her husband. Contemporary records and archaeological finds show she played a big role in court decisions. Some historians think she even ruled when Juba was away, issuing decrees, managing the grain fleet, and settling tribal disputes. She wasn't just a queen. She was a powerful partner, and maybe most impressively, she did all this without starting a single war. Cleopatra Selene's reign was stable, a rare thing in the ancient world, and even rarer for a woman of her lineage. She didn't need to conquer land. She conquered imaginations. In Rome, she used to be paraded like a trophy. Now, she was a respected ruler, admired by senators and merchants alike. Not out of fear, but respect. A queen with every reason to seek revenge, but chose strategy instead. When Cleopatra Selene II took the throne of Mauritania, her longest-lasting legacy began to take shape, not in marble or coins, but in the form of her son, Tommy of Mauritania. Born into this balanced dynasty, Tommy was the last thread of a glorious bloodline stretching from Macedonian conquerors to Egyptian gods. Through him, Selene hoped to secure the continuity of everything she'd rebuilt from the ashes. She raised him not just as a prince, but as a living embodiment of the empire. Tommy's education was elite, worthy of someone related to both Julius Caesar and the Ptolemies. He studied Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Egyptian religious customs, and, most importantly, he learned the art of diplomacy from the best teacher around his mother. Maybe Selene saw a bit of herself in that boy. Like her, he was born into a political chess game. Like her, he'd have to survive a world where lineage was both a crown and a curse. But, unlike her, Tommy had the advantage of stability. Raised in a kingdom his mother had built into a sanctuary of balance. Still, Selene wasn't naive. She'd seen how fast dynasties fell when heirs turned weak or reckless, so she prepared him not with swords, but with negotiation, politics, and culture. She made sure he mastered the language of power, literally and metaphorically. But maybe the coolest thing is Selene never tried to restore Egypt through her son. She knew better. The world had changed. Augustus ruled with an iron fist, and any attempt to revive old claims got shut down fast. Instead, she quietly wove Egypt into Mauritania's soul through temples, images, customs, passing that subtle legacy to her son, Tommy. Her plan worked at least for a while. Eventually, Tommy succeeded his father and ruled as a legit king. Rome accepted him, respected him, even gave him an honorary advisor role. He was treated like a real prince because he really was one. By now, Celine had done what her parents couldn't, secured her line's survival without spilling blood. Her child wasn't a symbol of failure, but of adaptation, thanks to him. Her quiet empire lasted a bit longer. History usually favors the loud ones, conquerors, revolutionaries, crazy emperors. But Cleopatra Selene left her mark in whispers. No dramatic speeches survived, no scrolls recording her philosophy. Yet her fingerprints are everywhere on coins, cities, policies, and the quiet survival of a dynasty once doomed. He was treated like a real prince because, well, he actually was. So far. Celine did what her parents couldn't, secured her bloodline without spilling any royal blood. Her child wasn't a symbol of failure, but a symbol of adaptation. Thanks to him. Her silent empire lasted a bit longer. History usually loves the loud ones, conquerors, revolutionaries, crazy emperors. But Cleopatra Selene left her legacy in whispers. No dramatic speeches survived. No scrolls recorded her philosophy. Yet her fingerprints are everywhere: coins, cities, policies, and the quiet survival of a doomed dynasty. As the dynasty's last years rolled in, Celine's name slowly faded from Roman records. Some historians chalk it up to political erasing. Others think she planned it that way. After all, fame in Rome came with a price, especially for a woman like her. Maybe she preferred ruling, behind the scenes, efficient, invisible, and scandal-free. No drama, no betrayals, no steamy affairs, no orders made in a fit of rage. That alone is pretty impressive. Celine navigated a world ruled by male egos, shifting alliances, and cultural biases without giving her enemies a foothold. She knew power wasn't for show. It's a tool for subtle use. And maybe that subtlety was, instead, she made sure her people, those who followed her from Alexandria, or still remembered the old gods, found refuge in her hybrid kingdom. Archaeology shows Mauritania under her rule was a mashup of religious traditions. Egyptian art hangs out next to Roman mosaics. North African temples dedicated to Isis sit beside altars to Jupiter. It's like a spiritual patchwork quilt, quietly stitched by her own hands. Even the capital, Caesarea, felt her influence. Named after Augustus, but with a soul that echoed her. Public works thrived. Elegant architecture and local crafts got a government-sponsored prestige boost. She wasn't rebuilding Alexandria. She'd grown up and out of those shoes. But the memory lingered of a mother, both celebrated and slandered. A disgraced and fallen father. A lost city. A dynasty ended. And a bloodline nearly wiped out. Celine never talked about these things. History didn't give her a voice, but she didn't need one. Her silence spoke volumes. Every policy she made, every temple she funded, every symbol she wore was a sentence in an unwritten memoir. The world forgot her words, but remembered her results. Then, poof, she vanished. Cleopatra Selene, queen, daughter of legends, ruler of a kingdom forged from cultural gold, suddenly gone from the records. No triumphant resting place, no preserved tomb. No Roman historian bothered to note her final days. Born into a dazzling historical era, her death flickered out like a candle. We estimate she died around 5 BC, based on her sudden disappearance from official documents and coins. One day, she's co-ruling Mauritania. The next coin just says Juba. No ceremony, no funeral inscription, just silence. But that silence says something. In ancient royalty, a quiet exit usually meant one of two things. She either died a natural death mourned in private, or someone had a reason to erase her. Given the political roller coaster she rode for decades, either's possible, yet no scandal left a trace. Juba kept ruling after her death, but Mauritania never quite shined like before. He married Glaphyra, a Cappadocian princess, but that was brief and left way less legacy. Juba wrote books, ruled diligently, but something about the kingdom faded. Seems Selene was more than a queen. She was the soul of the court. Her son, Tomi, inherited the title like his parents. But even he met a tragic end, executed by Emperor Caligula in Rome decades later, for reasons still debated. With him, Cleopatra Selene's bloodline truly ended, but her fingerprints lingered. Coins with her crowned image kept circulating. The Egyptian cult she supported lasted centuries in North Africa. The cities she shaped, like Caesarea, became Roman hubs of trade and learning. Her legacy wasn't in flashy love stories, but in the slow shift of civilization itself. No grand tomb, but she built a kingdom. No famous speeches, but her policies changed lives. No armies, but she tamed the chaos left by her parents and turned it into order. The court, her son, Tomi, inherited the title just like his parents, but even he met a tragic end. Executed by Emperor Caligula in Rome decades later for reasons still debated by historians. With him, Cleopatra Selene's bloodline pretty much vanished, but her fingerprints stayed. Coins bearing her crowned image kept circulating. The Egyptian cults she supported lasted centuries in North Africa. The cities she shaped, like Caesarea, became hubs of trade and learning under Roman rule. Her legacy wasn't flashy love affairs, but the slow transformation of civilization. No grand tomb, but she built a kingdom. No famous speeches, but her policies changed lives. No army, but she tamed the chaos left by her parents and turned it into order. Cleopatra Selene disappeared from the history books, but only because she carved her name into the empire. And maybe that was her smartest move, vanishing not as a victim of history, but as its architect. Cleopatra Selene II may have died quietly, but her story didn't end there. Her legacy lived on through her son, Tomi of Mauritania, a prince who embodied ambition, myth, and survival across centuries. He was the last known heir of the Tomi dynasty, the final reflection of Alexander the Great's generals and the Egyptian pharaohs. Raised in a world of luxury, that Tomi inherited not just a kingdom, but a whole political chess game. Young, rich, fluent in Greek, Latin, and diplomatic jargon, his reign in Mauritania wasn't as flashy as his mother's, but still marked by steady prosperity and loyalty to Rome. But he was walking a tightrope, a royal vassal with royal blood too big for Rome to ignore. At first, he played his part well. Augustus made him a Roman senator, and later emperors welcomed him at court. He was praised for his wealth, generosity, and classy lifestyle. Purple clothes. That was his right. Dining with emperors. Absolutely. But every nod of approval came with a whisper of jealousy. Tomi had something. Many Roman nobles feared ancient legitimacy, and Rome, especially under shaky rulers, never trusted a legacy. His downfall came under Caligula, the famously unstable emperor. Ptolemy visited Rome around 40 AD, dressed to the nines like a king, probably a bit too much for Caligula's fragile ego. According to ancient sources, Caligula said, "There's only room for one king in Rome." Shortly after, Ptolemy was executed. No trial, no war, just sudden erasure. With his death, the dynasty of Cleopatra, Alexander, and Isis finally came to an end. The bloodline that once ruled the most cultured city on earth didn't end with battle or rebellion, but with the paranoid whim of an emperor. But Ptolemy's death, like his mother's, couldn't erase their influence. Mauritania was annexed and reorganized as a Roman province. But it carried the blueprint Selene had drawn: cities, temples, and blended traditions. Even in death, she shaped the land. And though Rome tried to bury this dynasty, it never quite succeeded. Ptolemy's family became legend. Cleopatra Selene, once considered war booty, outlived her enemies thanks to legacy, culture, and her son's brief but blazing flame. Ptolemy finally fell, but the world he inherited still bore her name, her symbol, and her quiet power. Before the age of printing, before the ink-soaked scrolls of Alexandria, clay was cold, heavy, and weirdly eternal. And on top of that evenly scratched block of clay sat the first known library in human history, built by a king who wanted to be remembered not for wars, but for wisdom. Welcome to Nineveh. The year was around 650 BC. The king was Ashurbanipal, ruler of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who called himself king of the world. But unlike most kings of his time, Ashurbanipal wasn't just into temples and trophies. He wanted something deeper, a treasure trove of all human knowledge, right in the palace. He ordered a gigantic library to be built. Ashurbanipal's library wasn't just a book dump. It was a deliberate project to collect, organize, and protect Mesopotamia's intellectual heritage. And when we say collect, we really mean confiscate, copy, and catalog. Royal spies were sent all over the empire to demand priests, scholars, and scribes hand over texts. By the time the library was nearly done, it held over 30,000 clay tablets, medical texts, astrology, religious rituals, royal decrees, laws, dictionaries, even love poetry and demon-slaying guides. Among them was the oldest known version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, carefully inscribed on baked clay. Each tablet was labeled and sorted into rooms by genre and function. Ashurbanipal's library even had a primitive referencing system, with labels carved on tablets showing where each text was located. You could call it the prototype of a catalog. Long before librarians came up with card systems, Ashurbanipal, he read them, or at least claimed to. Unlike most kings, he was proud to know Sumerian. Ashurbanipal, he read them, or at least claimed he did. Unlike most kings, he bragged about reading Sumerian and Akkadian, languages already ancient in his day. His inscription said, "I have read the exquisite tablets of the Sumerians and the inscrutable Akkadian language. Tough to master, but this treasure won't last forever." When Nineveh fell to the Babylonian-Median alliance in 612 BC, the palace burned down. Ironically, that fire preserved many tablets by baking them hard, keeping the text intact over time. Thousands of years later, archaeologists unearthed those charred ruins, and in that silence, they found a king's dream, a clay time capsule holding humanity's memory. Stubbornly, while the Assyrians etched knowledge into clay, the Egyptians went for something way classier: papyrus. With that, they built some of the world's first literary sanctuaries, houses of life, a mashup of temples, scriptoria, and archives, not your average public library. These were sacred spots where priests, scribes, and scholars guarded civilization's secrets like overprotective parents, nestled in grand temple complexes like Abydos, Thebes, and Edfu. The House of Life was basically a living institution, tightly linked to the gods, especially Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and magic. Inside, meticulous scribes hand-copied texts, hymns, myths, spells, star charts, medical notes, legal documents, and admin records. Each scroll wasn't just ink and papyrus, it packed divine power. The work was slow, repetitive, and sacred. Scribes trained from childhood in hieroglyphics and religious writing. One slip-up wasn't just a typo, it was a spiritual fail. And fragile papyrus had to be stored dry and carefully managed like a precious heirloom. Scrolls were kept in wooden boxes or ceramic jars, labeled with strings and tags. Every House of Life had its own filing system, though none survive fully intact today. Probably the most famous example was at Perenk, where royal medical texts were copied and preserved across generations. This might be where the Ebers Papyrus, the ancient Egyptian medical treatise packed with remedies, spells, and surgery tips, was born and passed around. But access to these libraries was super limited. Not public enlightenment centers, but exclusive workshops for priests and royal advisors. In Egypt, knowledge was power, and power was guarded like a dragon's hoard. What you knew could decide your social rank, religious role, or your fate in the afterlife, especially if your knowledge included spells from the Book of the Dead. Yet these institutions acted like bridges, connecting one generation of scribes to the next, preserving Egyptian cultural identity through conquests, droughts, and dynastic shakes. When invaders came, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the houses of life crumbled. Their scrolls vanished, burned, or rotted away. But fragments survived in tombs, buried with mummies or scattered through trade. Written in ink on brittle papyrus, ancient Egyptian wisdom never fully disappeared. It just slipped through history's cracks, waiting to be uncovered. Long before modern catalogs, Babylon had its own info empire built on bricks, stars, and divine order. While Ashurbanipal's library is the most famous, Babylon's scholarly hub spread across temples, ziggurats, and royal palaces. Here, libraries weren't just text warehouses. They were cosmic blueprints storing secrets of gods, calendars, and kings. The heart of Babylon's academic life was the Asagila and Ezida temples, home to priest scholars called Umanu. These guys weren't just copycats. They were mathematicians, astronomers, healers, and astrologers. And their library, compact, durable, and super specific. Clay tablets packed with lists, omens, rituals, and calculations were neatly stored in clay jars or mounted on walls like ancient filing cabinets. One of Babylon's coolest contributions was Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive collection of sky omens. It recorded thousands of years of star and planet observations linked to predictions about war, plague, or prosperity. These texts weren't just academic, they influenced royal decisions, battles, and even coronations. In a world run by signs, these stone tablets were the ultimate prophecy. And Babylon didn't stop at astronomy. Their library held math texts illustrating complex geometry and early algebra. For example, Plimpton 322 contains trigonometric calculations older than Greek math by over 1,000 years. To modern scholars, it's like the rough draft of a calculus textbook. Babylonian scribes used a system called siphons, little notes, at the bottom of tablets naming the scribe, origin, and sometimes a warning about stealing or misusing the knowledge. These weren't just records. They were ancient intellectual property claims. But as Babylon passed from one conqueror to another, Hittites, Persians, Greeks, the libraries slowly crumbled. Many tablets were looted or smashed, their shards scattered under centuries of dust. The dry climate saved some relics, but most got buried and forgotten. Until the 19th century, when excavations uncovered thousands of these stone tablets, even the broken ones, tiny fragments no bigger than your palm, held recipes, laws, spells, and star charts. They proved that long before Aristotle or Euclid, Mesopotamians built a knowledge system both practical and poetic. Babylon's shelves may have collapsed, but clay whispers still rise from the rubble. If knowledge had an ancient capital, it was Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great and ruled by his Ptolemaic successors, this Egyptian-Greek city became the beacon of ancient scholarship. With the great library of Alexandria at its heart, built in the 3rd century BCE inside a temple complex called the Museion, a shrine to the Muses, the library was more than a building. It was a dream to collect every book, scroll, and scrap of knowledge the world had to offer. Not some quiet room for local nerds, but an intellectual empire. Under kings like Ptolemy I and II, spies scoured the Mediterranean, buying or copying scrolls from every port. Any ship docking in Alexandria got searched, and every scroll on board was seized, copied, and stored. Even foreign works, Hebrew Bibles, Indian treatises, Babylonian astronomy, they were all translated into Greek. Estimates say the library held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Philosophy, medicine, engineering, poetry, botany, history, you name it. Homer's works got edited here. Archimedes' ideas passed through these walls. Even Eratosthenes, the librarian, used it to calculate Earth's circumference with jaw-dropping accuracy. The library wasn't just storage. It was an editing hub. Scholars compared texts, spotted errors, and made the earliest critical additions. They preserved the best and questioned the rest. But Alexandria's brilliance also made it fragile. Fire, war, politics slowly eroded its shelves. The first major blow might have come in 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar's troops got stuck in Alexandria's harbor and set fire to enemy ships, accidentally burning parts of the library. Later, as the Roman Empire solidified, Alexandria became a battleground for pagan, Christian, and Gnostic ideologies, affecting the city's library. By the time the Muslims conquered in 642 CE, no one's sure what survived. Some say Caliph Umar ordered its destruction, claiming, if these books agree with the Quran, they are redundant If not, they are heresy. But historians still argue whether the library had vanished centuries earlier or not. One thing's certain: the Great Library was gone. No scrolls survived, yet its legend lives on. Evidence shows the idea of a global library was just too powerful to be snuffed out completely. Alexandria became a symbol of what humanity once had, and sadly, what it lost. While Alexandria basked in fame, another city quietly built a rival library, one set to challenge Alexandria's dominance and revolutionize writing itself. That city was Pergamon, located in what is now Turkey, under the Attalid dynasty in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Pergamon became a cultural hub with its own library at the city's core. Founded by King Eumenes II, this library reportedly held over 200,000 scrolls. Pergamon, located in what's now Turkey, under the Attalid dynasty in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Pergamon became a cultural hotspot, and at its heart was the Pergamon Library. Founded by King Eumenes II, it reportedly held over 200,000 scrolls, second only to Alexandria. But it wasn't just about numbers. Pergamon focused on quality, with carefully curated texts, tight organization, and an academic vibe that nurtured philosophy, medical advances, and historical records. Plus, it had a major advantage: parchment. Legend has it, when the Ptolemies in Egypt heard about Pergamon's rise, they banned export of papyrus to starve their rivals of writing material. Pergamon responded by perfecting animal skin parchment, not exactly new. But Pergamon's scribes turned it into a tough, reusable, smoother surface that held up better against moisture than papyrus. This tech leap changed everything. Scrolls got sturdier, tougher, and way more portable. This was the pivotal moment in the evolution from scroll to codex, the ancestor of the modern book. The Pergamon Library wasn't just a book storage spot. It was an academic hive, buzzing with Stoic philosophers and peripatetic thinkers, pushing advances in medicine, including early surgical studies. Galen, one of the most famous doctors of the ancient world, was born in Pergamon and probably pored over texts right in that very library. The rivalry between Pergamon and Alexandria sparked an intellectual arms race. Scholars flocked for the paychecks, housing, and prestige. Rulers became patrons of this brainy battle, and cities competed not by war, but by smarts. For a brief, shining moment, this was a golden age of collecting and conserving knowledge. Eventually, Pergamon's scrolls met a weird fate when Mark Antony married Cleopatra. Rumor has it he gifted the Pergamon Library, scrolls and all, to Alexandria as a love token, whether true or just a legend. The story symbolizes the tight link between this treasure trove of knowledge, power, empire, and romance. Though the Pergamon Library vanished, its legacy lives on in every bound book. Its parchment outlived empires. Its scrolls may be lost, but its innovations literally rewrote history. While the Mediterranean world traded scrolls and perfected parchment across the globe, ancient China was building its own literary empire, not born from myth or fire, but from bureaucracy, history, and rock-solid respect for writing. The Han Dynasty libraries, from 206 BCE to 220 CE, weren't just knowledge vaults. They were government tools, identity, and order incarnate. Han emperors got a crucial truth: whoever controls the records controls the story. So they launched a full-on imperial project to collect, copy, and standardize texts. Not just preserving classics. This was about shaping culture. Confucianism became the state ideology. And its foundational texts, the law books on rights and carefully curated classics, were held tight in royal libraries. The crown jewel was the Royal Library in Chang'an, the Han capital. Unlike Alexandria's open-door library, this one was off-limits to traveling scholars. It was a state archive, overseen by court historians, scholars, and clerks. Inside were not just literary works, but census records, astronomical observations, maps, laws, and genealogies. Every brushstroke on bamboo slips or silk scrolls screamed empire. One of history's most influential librarians came from this system, Liu Xiang, a Han scholar tasked with organizing the royal collection. He didn't just catalog books. He edited and annotated them, often deciding which versions survived. His son, Liu Xin, kept the legacy alive and created one of the earliest classification systems, grouping texts into 6 main categories: classics, philosophy, poetry, warfare, medicine, and divination. These efforts weren't without risk. Back in the Qin dynasty, infamous book burnings and scholar burials wiped out thousands of ancient works. The Han knew history's dangers. Their library was a cultural resurrection from the ashes, but the format was fragile. Early texts were written on bamboo strips tied with strings, flammable, mold-prone, and easy to decay. Others were painted on silk, elegant and pricey. Still, thanks to the Han, much of China's classical heritage survived. The royal libraries were less mythical than Alexandria's, but in reality, they might have preserved even more in China. The pen wasn't just equal to the sword, it sometimes outlasted it. Sword storage. As Buddhism spread across Asia, something else spread with it: libraries. Temples weren't just for praying. They turned into storage vaults of ideas, academic wonderlands, and fragile fortresses of knowledge, from India to China, Tibet to Japan. The Buddhist world built archives that saw books not as tools, but as sacred objects. This tradition started in India, where early Buddhist scriptures were memorized by monks. But as the empire grew, the need to write things down grew too. Palm leaf manuscripts inked, tied with string, wrapped in silk or cloth. Monasteries guarding these texts weren't just spiritual hubs. They were the ancient world's safe study spots. At Nanda, a big monastic university was founded in the 5th century AD. Thousands of monks studied and copied texts on philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy, and languages. Legend says Nanda's library held hundreds of thousands of books. It was traditionally split into 3 buildings: Ratna Sagara, the ocean of jewels; Ratnadi, the jewel sea; and Ratnaranjaka, the joy of jewels. Each building became rarer and more sacred. Nanda's library burned for months when invaders destroyed it in the 12th century. The flames didn't just consume paper, they devoured generations of thought, debates, and spiritual insights. Meanwhile, in Tibet, Buddhist libraries had an even more mysterious role. Texts were carved on wooden printing blocks or kept in hand-copied manuscripts. Whole rooms packed with Kangur Buddha's teachings and Tangur commentaries, wrapped in cloth and stored horizontally on shelves built into monastery walls. Each manuscript was a relic. Copying one was an act of devotion in China and Japan. Buddhist libraries embraced local innovations. Woodblock printing in China allowed mass production of sutras, and Japan's Ishiyamadera Temple became a hub storing thousands of scrolls. Monks often buried scriptures in stone jars, sutra mounds, to protect them from war or decay, believing these words would rise again in a brighter future. In the Buddhist world, libraries aren't just places, they're acts of compassion. Preserving a text is preserving the Dharma. Shelves are altars, ink is prayer. These sacred libraries might be quiet, but their influence spreads across continents, bringing peace, logic, and enlightenment through every manuscript. When we imagine ancient libraries, we picture scrolls and parchment, temples and marble. But across the ocean, that beauty was mostly destroyed before we could even study it. What we lost from the Maya, Aztec, and Inca libraries wasn't just texts, it was an entire worldview. The Maya were one of the most literate pre-Columbian civilizations. They developed a complex hieroglyphic system, mixing characters and syllables used to record astronomy, rituals, history, and cosmology. Their books, called codices, were made from bark paper, coated in white lime and folded like screens. These codices were painted in bright colors, packed with precision and symbolism, stored in temple vaults and royal libraries. At their peak, Maya families might own hundreds, if not thousands, of codices. But when the Spanish arrived, most were declared heretical and burned alive by missionaries. The most infamous case was Bishop Diego Dander, who ordered the destruction of a huge number of Maya books in 1562. Later, he wrote, "We found a vast amount of books about these figures, and since they contained nothing but superstition and devilish lies, we burned them all. Only 4 Maya codices survive today." The Aztecs also kept massive archives of Amoxin books written on deerskin, agave fiber, or bark paper. These documents included calendars, tribute records, history, and mythology. The scribes, called tlaquilos, painted complex hieroglyphs and symbols using natural pigments, creating vivid texts, both sacred and administrative. These libraries were often housed in royal palaces, and digital data, maybe some narrative info too, stored in the state archives. These records were read by trained officials called quipucamayaks and put to use, managing census, taxes, and military logistics across this sprawling empire. But then the Europeans showed up, bringing brutal cultural erasure along for the ride. The libraries got burned. The archives either torched or buried, and an entire intellectual tradition snuffed out in a single generation. Unlike Alexandria or Nineveh, there wasn't one big fire to blame, just colonial policies and missionary zeal wiping out centuries of smarts. The libraries in the Americas didn't just vanish. They were deliberately erased, and the silence they left behind echoes louder than any words. The story of ancient libraries isn't just about saving books. It's a tragic chronicle of loss. Ashurbanipal's clay tablets survived only because fire accidentally baked them into solid blocks. Alexandria's scrolls disappeared in smoke. Maya houses were burned down by terrifying hands. Buddhist texts from Nanda turned to ashes after invasions. Time, conquest, and oblivion conspired non-stop to wipe out what was once thought eternal. It's estimated over 90% of ancient literature is gone. Entire genres disappeared. Greek comedies, Roman technical manuals, Indian medical treatises, American historical records. We have the names of thousands of works, but not a single word. Their absence is a void we still feel today. But why did so much vanish? Part of the answer is the material: cracked clay, rotting papyrus, moldy bamboo, burnt parchment. Books before the printing press were fragile, one of a kind, and could fall apart from a little moisture. A leaky roof could destroy centuries of accumulated thought. War made it worse. Invaders didn't just torch libraries. They erased identities. In ancient times, destroying a people's books was as strategic as wiping out their armies. The rest of the answer is political. Knowledge is power, and power is selective. When regimes changed, libraries changed too. New rulers erased old ideologies. Heretical scrolls got shredded. Rival authors got erased. Entire schools of thought vanished because they didn't fit the ruling narrative anymore. But some fragments remain. Clay shards pulled from the rubble. Singed scrolls opened with modern tech. Quotes from lost books preserved in surviving ones. A Roman historian mentions a vanished Greek poet. A Buddhist monk's manuscript copy survived after the original was burned. A Maya symbol carved on a temple wall that no missionary ever found. These scraps are our bridges to ancient minds. They remind us knowledge is never truly safe, but never fully gone either. Libraries may burn, but ideas live on. They survive through translation, memory, and adaptation. Digital archives, satellite backups, and global databases today are our attempt to defy that long history of loss. But the lesson still holds. Preservation isn't a one-time act. It's a responsibility. And every time we open a book, ancient or modern, we help keep the fading flame of memory alive. Rapa Nui, better known to the outside world as Easter Island, sits lonely in the South Pacific, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continental shore. Isolated, windy, and creepily quiet. This island is only about 63 square miles, but it holds one of the biggest mysteries of ancient engineering, the Moai statues. Nearly $1,000 giant stone figures with thick eyebrows, long noses, and tight lips, all standing or toppled across the island. Most face inland, backs to the sea, as if watching over the land. Many skeletons lie half buried underground, their bodies hidden beneath centuries of soil. Others rest in partially quarried, abandoned stone mines. Their presence sparks awe, fear, and hundreds of unanswered questions. Why were they built, like the sea watching the land? Many corpses were buried halfway underground, their bodies hidden beneath centuries of soil. Others lay in partially quarried, abandoned stone mines. Their presence sparks awe, fear, and hundreds of unanswered questions. Why were they built? Who carved them? How did they move these giants? And why did their creators suddenly quit? These mysteries have haunted explorers, archaeologists, and storytellers for generations. To outsiders, Easter Island looks like a frozen volcanic stone puzzle. But to the Rapa people, This island isn't some unsolved mystery. It's home. The Moai statues, not relics of a lost civilization, they're their ancestors. Although the first written records come from Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, the island's story began centuries before. Polynesian explorers first settled this remote paradise, navigating by stars and ocean waves. They named it Rapa Nui, meaning Great Rapa, and built a society rooted in deep spiritual traditions, clan identity, and a sacred bond between the living and the dead. The Moai weren't carved for worship, but as vessels of ancestral spiritual power. Each statue represented a revered chief or important ancestor watching over their descendants. These statues weren't just art. They were guardians, mediators between heaven and earth. But time, like the ocean, is ruthless. When European trade arrived, island society changed. Statues were toppled. Forests vanished. All that remained were whispers of what once stood tall. And so, Rapa Nui became a question carved in stone. Its meaning didn't disappear, but was buried under centuries of silence. Long before the Moai stood proud on the island's hills, the land was pristine, lush, forested, and quiet, filled only with the calls of seabirds echoing over volcanic slopes. Then, around 800 to 1200 AD, a fleet of Polynesian outrigger canoes arrived. These ocean masters navigated thousands of miles using only stars, waves, and bird flight paths. They came from Marisa, or Mangareva, bringing not just people, but pigs, chickens, taro, bananas, and sweet potatoes. Everything needed to build a new world. Landing on Rapa Nui meant touching the edge of the earth. It's one of the most remote inhabited islands on the planet. Yet, these settlers brought with them a full culture, complex social structure, oral history, deep spiritual beliefs, and grand stone-building traditions. Over time, the island split into clans, each controlling different territories and each protected by a sacred ancestor, a concept soon carved into stone. Early Rapa Nui people thrived. Archaeology shows they built villages, farmed in stone gardens to hold moisture, and raised chickens in rock enclosures. Their society was tightly organized, ruled by ariki, chiefs holding both political and spiritual power. Island life revolved around ancestor worship, believed to influence everything from crops to weather. This reverence reached its iconic peak in carving the Moai statues. It's key to understand that Rapa Nui wasn't some primitive or lost culture. It was highly sophisticated, adapting to a harsh, limited environment, built on a strong sense of continuity between the living and the dead. The settlers brought more than tools. They brought meaning. And this spiritual worldview sparked the decision to start carving giant statues. But in the early centuries, the island remained balanced. Forests still cloaked the land. The sea provided fish, fertile land. The first Moai would take many more generations to appear, but the cultural and spiritual foundation was laid for one of Earth's most extraordinary sculptural legacies. The story was just beginning. At the sacred heart of Rapa Nui lies Rano Raraku, a volcanic crater with steep slopes and soft, carvable rock. Most of the island's Moai were born here, not from legend or myth, but from painstaking craftsmanship. The stone used is hard volcanic tuff, a relatively soft compressed ash rock ideal for carving, at least at first. Over time, weather exposure toughened the statues and gave them their familiar worn look. Rano Raraku, or mythology. But from meticulous craftsmanship, the stone used is volcanic rock, a relatively soft compressed ash stone, perfect for carving. At least in the early days. Over time, weather exposure made these statues tough and weathered-looking classic outdoor wear and tear. Rano Raraku isn't just a quarry. It's a spiritual factory, a pilgrimage site where sweat, devotion, and sacred labor came together. From the cliffs and hillsides, Rapa Nui sculptors carved hundreds of moai statues, some unfinished, some completed but never moved. Today, nearly 400 statues still stand, or rather, freeze mid-action, like workers who just vanished halfway through their shift. Carving a moai wasn't a walk in the park. Each statue was commissioned by a clan to honor a specific ancestor, usually a powerful chief. The design was symbolic: long faces, thick eyebrows, long ears, and big noses. Bodies were usually minimalistic, with arms pressed tight to the sides and fingers carved in a thin, stylized fashion. Moai sizes range from a modest 6 feet to the colossal El Gigante, an unfinished giant statue over 70 feet tall, weighing around 150 tons. The sculptors used tools made from tough basalt stone, a volcanic rock way harder than you'd expect, shaped into chisels and axes. The whole process took months, sometimes years, with teams of artisans passing down their skills through generations. While working, the moai stayed glued to the rock face. Only near completion would they pry it free, slide it down the slope, and get ready for transport. The creepiest thing about Rano Raraku tons of statues still buried underground. Many look half-buried, but actually, they're complete figures with their lower halves swallowed by centuries of erosion. It creates this weird optical illusion, like the moai are sinking, when really they're just standing patiently until time slowly drowns them. This pit is home to the island's giant residents, and here, stone and spirit meet, where human hands shape volcanic ash into eternal ancestors. One of the coolest things about moai isn't just how they're carved, but where they're placed. Almost all moai on Rapa Nui face inland, turning their backs on the ocean. Not a coincidence. They weren't built to watch waves. They're watching people. Each statue stands on a stone platform called an ahu, a ceremonial spot that's both a foundation and often a burial place for the individual the moai represents. These ahu line the coast like spiritual outposts, marking family territories and facing the community's heart. Essentially, moai are guardians, embodiments of powerful ancestors watching over the village and offering spiritual protection to the Rapa Nui. Moai aren't just sculptures, they're living beings, vessels of mana, the sacred energy believed to exist in gods, chiefs, and revered dead. People believed that when a moai was raised, it transferred mana into the land, ensuring fertility, bountiful harvests, and tribal prosperity. They weren't just memorials, they actively participated in daily life. Bridging the spiritual and physical worlds, the features of moai are deliberately exaggerated to reflect ideal origins and divine power. Deep-set eyes, high cheekbones, and a long nose visually symbolize wisdom, strength, and sacred lineage. The long ears might represent the elite class, while the statue's stern face suggests eternal calm and vigilance. Some moai also sported big red stone hats called pukau, quarried from a different volcano, Punapau. These cylindrical additions could symbolize hairstyles or ceremonial headdresses, adding status and respect. Originally, the statues had inlaid coral eyes with pupils made from obsidian or red scoria, giving them a way more intense and lifelike gaze than the empty eye sockets we see today. When the eyes were added during rituals, the moai were said to see for the first time, transforming from stone into sacred beings. The moai's deep stare captures the heart of Rapa Nui's spirituality. These statues were never built for outsiders. They were set up to face their descendants, silently watching generation after generation come and go, unwavering, unblinking, eternal. So how do you move a 30-foot tall, 80-ton stone statue without wheels, cranes, or metal tools over rough terrain for centuries? This was the Rapa Nui's big mystery. Moai are scattered all over the island, many sitting on stone platforms miles away from the Rano Raraku quarry. Early guesses suggested they might have been dragged on wooden sleds or rolled on logs. Those ideas just raised more questions, especially considering the island's severe deforestation. Others, with wilder imaginations, claimed aliens or spiritual levitation were involved. But centuries-old mystery. That's the big puzzle for the Rapa Nui. Moai statues are scattered all over the island, many placed on stone platforms far from the Rano Raraku quarry. Early theories suggested dragging them on wooden sleds or rolling them on logs. Those ideas just sparked more questions, especially given the island's severe deforestation. Others, with wilder imaginations, proposed alien intervention or spiritual levitation. But the real answer might be in the island's oral history. According to Rapa Nui legend, the moai walked to their destinations. Sounds nuts at first. Right. But recently, researchers have taken this idea seriously, and it worked. In 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo ran a remarkable experiment. Using ropes and groups of people on either side of a moai, they managed to rock the statue forward, upright, in a controlled way, like shaking a heavy refrigerator. The key was balance, rhythm, and coordination. This way, moai could be transported standing up. Just as the legend said, no logs, no dragging, no sci-fi, just human skill and tradition. The base of many moai statues backs up this theory too. They have a curved bottom, flat in the back, rounded in front, showing they were meant to tilt and pivot forward, not just lie flat. Moving them like this needed a big crew, plant fiber ropes, and, above all, faith. In Rapa Nui belief, the power moving the moai came from mana, the sacred energy of ancestors. Chiefs and priests were thought to control this spiritual force, making the statues come alive during ceremonies. So while engineers see physics, the Rapa Nui saw divine intervention. Actually, they're both right. Moving moai wasn't just a tech challenge. It was a ritual, a public show of unity, devotion, and connection to ancestors. The moai don't move by magic. They move because people believed they had to. And with that belief, the greatest engineering marvel of Rapa Nui isn't stone. It's human teamwork, powered by spiritual purpose. Over centuries, building Moai didn't slow down. It sped up. The early clan harmony gave way to fierce competition as each group tried to honor their ancestors with bigger, flashier statues. What started as spiritual devotion slowly turned into a pride-fueled rivalry. Clans vied for dominance not through war, but stone crafting. Bigger Moai meant more mana, more prestige, and stronger ancestral power. Each clan tried to outdo the others by erecting taller statues, adding new features, and building more elaborate ceremonial platforms. The race wasn't just about size, it was spiritual one-upmanship. This contest sparked major innovations. The appearance of Pukao, huge red volcanic stone topknots from Punapao, added both height and symbolic weight. These hair buns, some weighing up to 12 tons, might represent the hairstyles of high chiefs or sacred headdresses, a visual reminder of divine favor. The Moai design evolved too. Early statues were short and wide, but over time, they got slimmer, sharper, and way taller. Some later, Moai towered over 30 feet, looming like ancient giants over villages. But this escalation came at a cost. To support the growing building frenzy, the island's forests were chopped down. Wood was used for farming, fuel, boat building, and according to older theories, for moving statues. When the tree cover vanished, soil erosion worsened, farm yields dropped, and fresh water became harder to manage. The resources that sustained the Moai culture started drying up. But the people didn't stop. Instead, they carved more statues, bigger and bigger. They dug deeper into spiritual traditions, hoping ancestors would restore balance. But the scales were tipping forward as the island's ecosystem collapsed. Clan tensions boiled over. Competition turned to resentment. The cooperative spirit that once fueled these giants began to crack under survival pressure. The heyday of Moai building became a burden, but stopping was unthinkable. Moai were more than symbols. They were the heartbeat of Rapa Nui identity. So the islanders kept carving sacred inscriptions into stone, even as the ground beneath them thinned. A spiritual arms race was underway, and nobody wanted to lose. By the 17th century, the unimaginable happened. Rapa Nui was falling apart. The very system that united the island ancestor worship through Moai building had pushed its resources to the brink. The forests were gone, without trees, no canoes for offshore fishing, no wood for building or cooking, and no shelter from the island's brutal sun and wind. Spiritual traditions, hoping ancestors would restore balance. But the scale started tipping. As the island's ecosystem degraded, tensions between clans flared up. Competition turned into resentment. The cooperative spirit that once powered these giants began cracking under survival pressure. The golden age of Moai building became a burden. But stopping was unthinkable. Moai weren't just symbols. They were the heartbeat of Rapa Nui identity. So, islanders kept carving these reverent stone figures, even as the ground beneath them thinned out. A spiritual arms race was underway, and no one was willing to lose. By the 17th century, the unthinkable happened. Rapa Nui was unraveling. The very system that united the island ancestor worship through Moai building pushed its resources to the brink of collapse. Forests vanished. No trees meant no fishing boats, no wood for building or cooking, and no shelter from the island's harsh sun and wind. The once fertile volcanic soil, sheltered by roots and shade, eroded away. Crops wilted, fresh water got scarce. Yet, even as survival got tougher, statues kept appearing bigger, more complex, demanding more effort. The island's spiritual drive never quit, but soon enough, people did something drastic. They stopped making moai. Some statues were abandoned mid-transport, scattered along ancient roads like others were only half finished in the quarry, their chisels frozen in time. The spiritual arms race had hit the wall. The ancestors just couldn't supply what the earth couldn't grow. Then came the fall. Archaeology shows that starting in the late 1600s, moai statues all over the island were deliberately toppled. Their necks snapped, faces smashed. This wasn't Mother Nature's doing. Nope, it was human conflict. Clans started fighting over land, water, and bragging rights. Statues that once symbolized unity suddenly became targets of revenge and rage. Oral traditions call this the rise of the Huri Moai, the era of statue toppling. When faith in the Moai system collapsed, power shifted to a new spiritual political order. The Birdman cult was all about speed, competition, and ritual warfare, not the old polite ways. This cultural shakeup marked the end of an era. When the first European tourists showed up in 1722, they found a very different island society than the one that carved the moai. None of the statues were standing on their platforms. The once lively spiritual system was broken, and the people were struggling to survive on a deforested, divided land. The collapse of Rapa Nui wasn't a single event. It was a slow-motion train wreck caused by environmental collapse, social competition, and a spiritual system that just couldn't keep up. What was left were stone gods, toppled, staring at the sky like, seriously, how did it come to this? When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, he found a society already in ruins. Moai statues down, forests gone, the Rapa Nui people few, skinny, tired, and worn down by generations of hardship. Roggeveen's crew noticed the statues and the barren landscape but didn't get the civilization that made them. And then more outsiders kept coming. Over the next 2 centuries, contact with Europe wreaked havoc on Rapa Nui. Whalers, missionaries, traders, and slavers all showed up, leaving their marks and mostly erasing more than they recorded. In 1862, Peruvian slavers kidnapped nearly 1,500 Rapa Nui people, including chiefs and top scribes. Only a handful ever came back, along with smallpox, which spread like wildfire among the survivors. Even worse, Christian missionaries arrived, aiming to civilize the islanders. They banned traditional rituals, destroyed sacred carvings, and forced conversions, replacing Moai-centered spirituality with European imports. Oral traditions that preserved the island's history for centuries were suppressed, and the Rangarongo script possibly, the only indigenous writing system in Oceania, nearly vanished. By the late 19th century, the island's population had dropped to just over 100. Colonial powers carved up Rapa Nui land, leasing it for sheep grazing, fencing off ancestral sites, and confining the Rapa Nui to a tiny corner of the island. Even their access to their own moai was restricted. The statues, once living symbols of family and power, became silent monuments forgotten, looted, or treated like oddities by explorers and foreign collectors. European archaeologists carted off statues, ritual objects, even human remains, shipping them to museums in London, Paris, and Santiago. Some moai were cut at the base and taken whole, now displayed thousands of miles from their sacred homes. The island became a cultural case study, but the Rapa Nui never forgot who they were. Even in forced silence, this island became a cultural case study for the ages. But the Rapa Nui never forgot who they were. Even in forced silence, they still carried the memory of Mai. Traditions survived, hidden, whispered, passed down in pieces, and over centuries. People slowly reclaimed the stories carved in stone. But first, the world had to learn how to listen. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Rapa Nui began a slow but steady process of cultural restoration. The moai statues, once toppled and buried by time, conflict, and neglect, were gradually raised again. This time, not just monuments of the past, but symbols of resilience. In the 1950s, famed Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl drew. Sure, his theories were a bit off, especially the whole South American influence thing. But his work sparked worldwide archaeological interest and curiosity. Researchers started pouring in, not to loot like before, but to study and restore. Serious restoration efforts kicked off. The toppled moai got lifted back onto their stone pedestals. Coral eyes were recreated. Those fancy pukao top knots were put back on. Ancient roads, quarries, and ritual sites got mapped and examined. A clearer picture of the Rapa Nui civilization began to emerge. It wasn't some mystical mystery, but a showcase of engineering skill, spiritual depth, and cultural complexity. But the loudest voices were no longer the foreign scholars. They were the Rapa Nui themselves. The descendants of the original builders started reclaiming their language, rituals, and land rights. By 2017, Chile officially handed over control of Rapa Nui National Park, which includes most of the island's archaeological sites, back to the Rapa Nui community. Now, locals oversee the moai and their care, and excavation and conservation decisions are guided by cultural sensitivity and ancestral knowledge. New generations are learning their ancestors' stories, not just from textbooks, but from elders, chants, dances, and the moai statues themselves. The effort to crack Rongorongo, the island's mysterious script, keeps chugging along with cautious optimism. While global institutions like the British Museum and the Louvre face growing pressure to return moai and sacred artifacts stolen during colonial times, today, the Rapa Nui stand at a crossroads between memory and modern life. Tourists flood in waves, and economic growth brings both chances and risks. But the people keep defending their heritage, not as a frozen relic, but as a living tradition. The moai are no longer silent guardians of a lost world. Now, they witness survival, a culture that's weathered collapse, colonization, and erasure, yet still finds a way to rise again. Stones crack, forests burn, voices fall silent, but the ancestors stand firm.